attractive in the sense of offering, these lonely bachelors a wonderful home and a caring wife and regular home-cooked Norwegian meals. And
a cold farmhouse blaze lights the Indiana sky on the night of April 28, 1908. Fire crews from La Porte rush to the scene, but the structure is already collapsing inward, flames consuming decades of secrets. When they finally drag a trunk from the smoking ruins at dawn, they count what's left of men who came with cash and wedding dreams and never left. A newspaper across the world in Australia spits a phrase that lands like a verdict. This American Lucrezia Borgia. She is Belle Gunness. The public saw a hard-working widow on a tidy 48-acre farm on McClung Road. A woman who placed advertisements seeking companionship, who corresponded with lonely men who seemed to embody the promise of domestic partnership in rural America. The private record shows something else entirely, a calculated predator who monetized intimacy with industrial efficiency. Between the late 1880s and 1908, husbands and suitors disappeared from Chicago to Indiana, from Norwegian immigrant communities to Midwestern bachelor farmers. 11 sets of remains were recovered after the April 28, 1908 fire, their bodies dismembered and buried in depressions around the property. Investigators suspected many more. Some estimates reached 40 victims. The case became a national and international spectacle because of one through line that newspapers seized upon: money before love, letters before graves, insurance policies before wedding vows. Born Brynhild Paulsdatter Størseth in Selbu, Norway on November 11, 1859, she emigrated to the United States in 1881, part of the Great Scandinavian Migration Wave. She arrived in Chicago and quickly married Mads Sorensen, a fellow Norwegian immigrant. Early life records show hardship and poverty, but no clear pathway to the woman she would become. The first documented suspicious death came in 1900 when Mads Sorensen died on the one day two insurance policies overlapped, netting Belle approximately $8,500, a fortune for the time. Their home had also conveniently burned, yielding more insurance money. In 1902, she married Peter Gunness, a fellow widower in La Porte, Indiana. He died in 1903 when a heavy sausage grinder fell from a shelf and crushed his skull while he sat in the kitchen. The coroner ruled it accidental. Belle collected the insurance. By 1904, she owned the farm outright and had refined her system to a science. From roughly 1904 to 1908, Belle Gunness cycled suitors through the farm with assembly line precision. The method was sophisticated and low noise. She placed Lonely Hearts advertisements in Scandinavian language newspapers and mainstream Midwestern periodicals. The ads presented her as a wealthy widow seeking a partner, emphasizing financial security and domestic comfort. Replies poured in from Norwegian bachelors across the region, from Illinois to Minnesota, from men who'd saved for years and dreamed of land and family. Belle's correspondence was warm, romantic, and specific. She urged men to bring their savings in cash, to tell no one of their plans, to come ready to start a new life immediately. Some brought $1,000, others $3,000. Life savings sewn into coat linings or carried in leather satchels. The pattern surfaces not in folklore but in contemporary newspapers, bank records, and the possessions found buried on the property. When the men arrived, Belle welcomed them warmly. Neighbors occasionally saw unfamiliar men working around the farm for a day or two. Then the men would vanish. Belle would explain, if asked, that the suitor had moved on or wasn't a good match or went to North Dakota. In reality, the victims were dead within days, sometimes within hours. The method was poisoning, likely strychnine or arsenic administered in food or drink, or blunt force trauma delivered at night. After death came dismemberment with a meat saw in the basement. The body parts were wrapped in burlap or oilcloth, weighted if necessary, and buried in depressions near the hog pen, in the garden, or under the privy. Belle's physical strength was noted by contemporaries. She stood nearly 6 feet tall and was powerfully built, capable of handling the butchering and burial alone, though her hired man Ray Lampher may have assisted at times. The victim profile was tragically consistent: middle-aged immigrant men, typically Norwegian or Scandinavian, unmarried or widowed, with documented cash assets drawn by promises of marriage and partnership on a prosperous farm. Andrew Helgelien from South Dakota arrived in January 1908 with approximately $2,900. His brother Arsel grew concerned when Andrew's letters stopped. Old Budsberg from Wisconsin, who brought $1,500, disappeared in 1907. Jenny Olsen, Belle's own adopted daughter from her marriage to Mads Sorensen, vanished in 1906 at age 14, sent away to finishing school according to Belle, but likely murdered when she became old enough to notice the pattern or inherit from her father's estate. The escalation ends with the farmhouse fire. On April 28, 1908, flames consumed the Gunness home. Among the ruins, firefighters found the bodies of Belle's 3 remaining children: Myrtle, age 11, Lucy, age 9, and Philip, age 5, dead from smoke inhalation in their beds. In the cellar, they found a headless adult female body, severely burned. The local coroner initially identified it as Belle Gunness, but the measurements didn't match. The corpse was several inches shorter than Belle's known height of nearly 6 feet and significantly lighter than her known weight of over 200 pounds. The head was never found, despite extensive searching in the ash. Within days, as news of the fire spread, Aslak Helgelien arrived in Laporte with a packet of Belle's letters to his brother Andrew. The letters were tender, specific, and calculated, promising love and partnership while urging Andrew to bring all his money in cash. Helgelien demanded the property be searched. Sheriff Albert Smutzer organized a systematic excavation. On May 5, 1908, farmhands digging near the hog pen struck soft earth and burlap. The first sack contained human remains, then another, and another. Over the following weeks, the excavations exposed a charnel ground. 11 complete or partial sets of remains were recovered and documented, though some reports suggest more fragmentary evidence was found. The bodies were in various states of decomposition. Some had been there for years, others for months. Personal effects found with the remains, watches, rings, wallet contents, were matched to missing men whose families had filed inquiries. Andrew Helgelien's remains were identified by his dental work and a distinctive ring. Ole Budsberg's watch was recovered. Jenny Olsen's teeth were found in a burlap sack. The most disturbing detail, repeated in newspaper accounts across the country, was the industrial scale and bureaucratic precision. Courtship by post, documented cash withdrawals from banks when suitors departed for Indiana, then disposal that treated human beings as waste products. Belle Gunness had turned her farm into a death factory that operated for at least 4 years, possibly longer. The investigation broke wide when Aslak Helgelien's persistence forced authorities to take the disappearances seriously. Ray Lamphere, Belle's former hired hand and rumored lover, was arrested and charged with arson and murder. At his trial in November 1908, the prosecution argued that Lamphere had set the fire in revenge after Belle fired him. The defense and Lamphere himself claimed Belle was alive, that she had murdered the woman found in the cellar, possibly a housekeeper or drifter, staged the fire to fake her own death, and escaped with a fortune estimated at $30,000 to $100,000. Forensic dentistry was in its infancy, but a local dentist examined the teeth found with the headless corpse and testified they matched Belle's bridge work. Other experts disagreed, noting the body's size discrepancy. No trial ever put Belle Gunness in the dock. Ray Lamphere faced a jury in November 1908. The central questions were, did he set the fire? And was the headless corpse actually Belle? Testimony filled weeks. Neighbors described Belle's strength and cold demeanor. Victims' families wept. Forensic experts debated. The jury convicted Lamphere of arson but acquitted him of murder, apparently believing Belle had set the fire herself or was complicit. He was sentenced to prison, where he died in December 1909 of tuberculosis. On his deathbed, Lamphere gave a confession to a prison chaplain claiming Belle had indeed escaped, that he had helped her stage the scene, and that she had killed more than 40 people. His account was published in newspapers, but never legally verified. Final Fate remains one of American crime's enduring mysteries. Official records list Belle Gunness as deceased in the fire on April 28, 1908, at age 48. If those records are accurate, she died by her own hand or by Lamphir's, escaping earthly justice through flames. If Lamphir's deathbed confession holds truth, she lived as a fugitive under an assumed name. Alleged sightings persisted for decades. In Chicago in 1909, in Los Angeles in 1931, in the Midwest throughout the 1920s. None were confirmed. In 2007, forensic anthropologists exhumed the headless corpse from the La Porte Cemetery and conducted DNA analysis, comparing samples to Belle's known descendants. The results were inconclusive due to sample degradation. The mystery remains technically unsolved. The cultural legacy is fixed and permanent. Belle Gunness became the template for the Black Widow serial killer, the woman who uses romantic or familial intimacy as a hunting ground, who treats domestic space as a killing field, and who monetizes trust. Her case inspired books, films, a musical, and countless true crime retrospectives. She is remembered as Lady Bluebeard, after the fairy tale villain who murdered his wives. La Porte erected a historical marker, though the farm itself is long gone. The case established protocols for investigating suspicious deaths among elderly men seeking companionship and highlighted the vulnerability of immigrant communities where language barriers and cultural isolation made victims less likely to be missed quickly. Belle Gunness proved that a woman could be every bit as cold, calculating, and lethal as the most notorious male serial killers, and that domesticity could be a perfect disguise. What forges a person who treats love letters as ledgers and lovers as assets to be liquidated? Poverty and ambition can explain the hunger for wealth, the willingness to lie, even to steal. They do not explain the ash and bone, the sacks in the hog pen, the children's bodies in the fire. They do not explain the capacity to write tender words to a man while planning his butchery. We move from the ash of Indiana to a smile that never matched the autopsy reports, from farmhouse fires to a booking photo that captured something worse than guilt: enjoyment. A police photographer snaps a woman who grins through the booking process in Tulsa, Oklahoma in October 1954. Her fifth and final husband is on a slab at the medical examiner's office. The toxicology screen arrives days later, and the numbers tell a story that spans 3 decades. Arsenic, in quantities that leave no doubt about intent, method, or guilt. Nanny Doss. The public persona was folksy and romantic, a middle-aged woman perpetually disappointed in love, but ever hopeful that the next husband would be the one. She read romance magazines and Lonely Hearts columns with the dedication of a scholar, always seeking the fairy tale ending she claimed to crave. She giggled frequently, spoke in homespun phrases, and presented as a harmless southern eccentric. The private reality was serial poisoning executed across multiple states over nearly 3 decades. Between 1927 and 1954, she murdered at least 4 husbands: Charlie Braggs, Frank Harrelson, Arlie Lanning, and Samuel Doss, and is credibly linked to the deaths of her mother, 2 sisters, 2 of her own children, a grandson, and possibly a nephew. Conservative estimates place her victim count at 11. She is notorious not simply for the body count, but for her affect during interrogation and trial. She giggled as investigators recounted the deaths, smiled for newspaper photographers, and seemed to genuinely enjoy the attention. Reporters dubbed her the Giggling Granny, the Lonely Hearts Killer, and the Jolly Black Widow. Born Nancy Hazel on November 4, 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama, she grew up in grinding rural poverty under the control of an authoritarian father, James Hazel, who forbade his daughters any form of recreation, romance, or independence. Nancy and her siblings were pulled from school early to work. She was forbidden makeup, parties, dances, or interaction with boys. At age 7, she sustained a severe head injury when the train she was riding lurched and her head struck a metal bar. She suffered headaches, depression, and possible cognitive effects for the rest of her life, a detail documented in later psychiatric evaluations and offered here only as biographical context, not as mitigation or excuse for the murders she would commit as an adult. At 16, she married Charlie Braggs to escape her father's household. The marriage was immediate dysfunction. Braggs was controlling, his mother meddlesome, the living situation cramped and tense. Nancy gave birth to 4 daughters between 1923 and 1927. 2 of the girls died in 1927 under mysterious circumstances, officially attributed to food poisoning, but never investigated as potential homicide. Braggs, terrified and suspicious, fled in 1928 with the eldest daughter, leaving Nancy with 1 remaining child. The marriage dissolved. Nancy, who had begun going by Nanny, discovered Lonely Hearts Clubs and matrimonial agencies in the late 1920s. These were commercial services that matched correspondence, often leading to courtship and marriage by mail. For Nanny, they became both escape and method. She married Robert Harrelson in the mid-1930s. He died in 1945, and she collected a modest insurance payout. The official cause of death was listed as acute alcoholism and associated complications, though later investigators suspected arsenic. She married Arlie Lanning in 1947 in Lexington, North Carolina. He died in 1950 of what was diagnosed as heart failure. Again, a small insurance policy paid out. The house also burned shortly after his death, another insurance claim. In 1952, she married Richard Morton in Kansas. He died within months, officially of a coronary event. In 1953, she married Samuel Doss of Tulsa, Oklahoma, through a Lonely Hearts correspondence. Her known killing spree spans from the late 1920s through October 1954, though the provable murders concentrate in the 1945 to 1954 period. The method was consistent and shockingly simple. Arsenic trioxide, available as rat poison in any hardware store, mixed into food. Stewed prunes were a favored vehicle because the sweetness and texture masked the bitter metallic taste. She also used arsenic in coffee, in pie, in canned fruit. The pattern was maddeningly predictable to modern forensic eyes, but invisible to mid-century rural doctors. A husband would report flu-like symptoms, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, stomach pain. He would seem to recover slightly, then relapse. The illness would be attributed to food poisoning, gastroenteritis, or a virus. Then the victim would die, usually within days to weeks of the onset. Death certificates listed natural causes, heart failure, kidney failure, acute gastric distress. Small life insurance policies, $500 to $2,500, would pay out. Nanny would grieve briefly, then place another Lonely Hearts ad. The geographic spread is significant. She moved from Alabama to North Carolina to Kansas to Oklahoma, always ahead of any developing suspicion. Each death occurred in a different jurisdiction, preventing pattern recognition. Family deaths were similarly dispersed. Her mother, Louisa Hazel, died suddenly in 1953 while visiting Nanny in Oklahoma, shortly after Nanny took out a small insurance policy on her. Nanny's sister, Dovie, died in her sleep at Nanny's home in Alabama in 1953. Investigators later suspected arsenic, but exhumation was never pursued due to time elapsed and decomposition. The pattern's true horror lies in its domesticity. Nanny Doss killed in the most intimate sphere, the kitchen, the sickbed, the family table. She played the role of caretaker while administering poison. She brought her dying husbands water, soup, medicine, and more arsenic. She sat by their bedsides, held their hands, and watched them die by degrees. And through it all, she smiled. The last husband, Samuel Doss, was a 58-year-old Tulsa man who met Nanny through the Diamond Circle Club, a Lonely Hearts organization. They married in June 1953. Samuel was religious, strict, about alcohol and morality, and apparently boring, everything Nanny's romance magazines had taught her to disdain. In September 1954, he checked into a Tulsa hospital, complaining of severe digestive distress. Doctors diagnosed a probable ulcer or gastric infection, treated him, and discharged him in early October. On October 5, 1954, he was readmitted in acute distress. Nanny visited daily, bringing him food from home to build up his strength. He seemed to stabilize. Then, on October 12th, just hours after Nanny brought him a special meal, Samuel Doss suffered sudden catastrophic system failure and died. Dr. Ned H. Owens, the attending physician, was deeply suspicious. The symptom progression, the timing, the wife's insistence on bringing outside food, all triggered alarm. Against family objections and without waiting for formal permission, Dr. Owens ordered a full autopsy and toxicological analysis. The results were unequivocal. Samuel Doss's organs contained massive quantities of arsenic, enough, the medical examiner noted, to kill 20 men. The concentration in the stomach and digestive tract indicated recent acute poisoning, likely within hours of death. Tulsa police detectives immediately focused on Nanny Doss. A search of her home found rat poison in the kitchen, though she claimed it was for rodent control. More significantly, detectives began contacting jurisdictions where her previous husbands had died. Insurance records, marriage licenses, and death certificates painted a clear pattern. Exhumations were ordered. On October 25, 1954, authorities exhumed the body of Richard Morton in Emporia, Kansas. Tissue analysis revealed arsenic. Arlie Lanning's exhumation in Lexington, North Carolina, yielded the same result. Frank Harrelson's remains, exhumed in Jacksonville, Alabama, contained arsenic. Despite years of decomposition, the poison persists in bone and hair indefinitely. Confronted with the evidence, Nanny Doss confessed on October 29, 1954. But the confession came with her signature giggle and a justification that chilled investigators. She had killed the men, she admitted, because they weren't romantic enough. They were dull, controlling, or didn't appreciate her. She'd been searching, she said, for a true romantic partner like the men in her magazines, and kept being disappointed. She never mentioned the insurance money in her confession, but financial records told that story clearly. She collected thousands of dollars across the murders, always moving, always spending, always needing more. In May 1955, Nanny Doss appeared before a Tulsa County court and pleaded guilty to the murder of Samuel Doss. Oklahoma prosecutors made a strategic decision not to seek the death penalty, explicitly because she was a woman, a disparity that sparked debate even in 1955. The judge sentenced her to life imprisonment. She was never tried for the other murders, though she remained a suspect in multiple deaths across 4 states. 4. Courtroom proceedings were surreal. Nanny smiled throughout, waved to spectators, and seemed to treat the trial as a form of celebrity event. When reporters asked if she felt remorse, she giggled and said the men had it coming for being unromantic. One prosecutor later recalled, "She giggled when she talked about the coffee she fixed him that killed him. She giggled when she described his symptoms. She giggled when we showed her the autopsy report." The contrast between the horror of the crimes and her cheerful demeanor created cognitive dissonance that fascinated and repulsed the public. Nanny Doss was transported to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, where she served 10 years. She died of leukemia on June 2, 1965, at age 59, still maintaining that she'd simply been unlucky in love. Prison staff reported that she remained cheerful and social to the end, never expressing regret for the lives she'd taken. Her case became a landmark in multiple fields. Forensic toxicologists used it to argue for mandatory autopsies in cases of sudden death where a spouse stood to benefit financially. Insurance investigators developed protocols to flag multiple claims by a single beneficiary. Law enforcement agencies began sharing data across jurisdictions to identify serial patterns, and psychiatrists debated whether Nanny's affect, the giggling, the apparent emotional disconnect, indicated psychopathy, a dissociative disorder, or simply a defense mechanism. No definitive diagnosis was ever reached. The cultural legacy is complex. Nanny Doss became a symbol of the Black Widow archetype, but also a case study in how stereotypes about gender can blind investigators. Because she was a woman, a grandmother, someone who baked pies and read romance magazines, her victims' deaths were attributed to natural causes for decades. Because she presented as harmless and even amusing, the horror of what she'd done was sometimes minimized in media coverage that played her up as a quirky character rather than a serial killer. Modern true crime analysts note that a man with the same victim count and methods would never be described as giggling or jolly. He would be called a monster, full stop. Was the smile a mask designed to deflect suspicion, or was it a symptom of genuine emotional pathology? Either way, arsenic turned proximity into profit and domestic care into murder. The next case shows how method can cross oceans and cultures, how a health supplement becomes a murder weapon when delivered with deliberate intent, and how a chilling courtroom statement can reveal more than any psychiatric evaluation.
Poisoning. Cyanide was used in the killing of The court heard how the accused amassed millions of euros worth of insurance payments and inheritance.
Even if I were executed tomorrow, I would die smiling. The line lands in a Kyoto courtroom in November 2017, spoken calmly by a 70-year-old woman in the defendant's chair. Her partners are dead, multiple men across multiple years. Cyanide binds the narrative like a chemical thread through silk. Chisako Kakehi. To the world of senior dating services in Kyoto and Osaka, she presented as a reserved, somewhat traditional widow seeking companionship in her later years. Respectful, soft-spoken, dressed modestly, she embodied the image of a lonely elder looking for connection in a society where aging alone is common and often stigmatized. In reality, she was a cold, methodical predator who targeted elderly men with assets, pensions, property, savings, and killed them with cyanide after securing financial benefits. Between 2007 and 2013, Japanese prosecutors proved 3 murders and 1 attempted murder. Investigators suspected her involvement in the deaths of at least 4 additional men, bringing the possible total to 7 victims. Japan's media called her the Black Widow of Kyoto because the method and the motive were transparently clear: cyanide for murder, inheritance for motive, and a pattern of short relationships ending in sudden death and financial gain. Born in 1946 in Japan, in the post-war period of reconstruction and hardship, Chisako Kakehi's early life remains largely undocumented in public records. She married young, had children, and spent decades in apparent conventional domesticity. After her long-term husband died of natural causes in the 1990s, she was left with modest resources and faced the prospect of aging in a society where elder poverty, particularly for women, is a significant concern. At some point, exactly when remains unclear, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would use romantic relationships as financial instruments, and she would use murder to accelerate the returns. In the mid-2000s, Kakehi began frequenting matchmaking agencies that catered to seniors. Japan has a robust industry of such services, addressing the loneliness and isolation of an aging population. These agencies conduct interviews, create profiles, and arrange meetings between compatible individuals. Kakehi's profile emphasized traditional values, interest in a stable partnership, and appreciation for a man who had worked hard and saved wisely, a description that, in hindsight, reads as victim selection criteria. She met men in their 70s and 80s, often widowers themselves, who owned homes or had pension income. The courtships were brief but intense. She presented as caring, attentive, skilled in the domestic arts that men of that generation valued. Within weeks or months, relationships would formalize through marriage or cohabitation agreements. Crucially, she would be named as beneficiary on life insurance policies, added to property deeds, or designated as heir in hastily drafted wills. Her confirmed active killing period runs from 2007 to 2013, though the true start may be earlier. The method was cyanide, one of the fastest acting and most lethal poisons available. Cyanide disrupts cellular respiration at the molecular level, causing rapid hypoxia and death that can occur within minutes of ingestion. It has a distinctive bitter almond smell, but not everyone can detect it genetically, and it can be masked in strongly flavored foods or drinks. Kakehi often disguised the poison in capsules she claimed were health supplements, a detail that is particularly cruel given Japan's cultural embrace of wellness products and the trust elderly people place in caregivers' recommendations. The victim profile is tragically consistent. Men aged 70 to 85, financially stable, recently widowed or long single, seeking companionship through formal matchmaking services. They were men who had worked their entire lives, saved carefully, and owned property in an era when that was achievable for middle-class Japanese. They were lonely. They trusted her. Minoru Hioki, 75, died in 2012, shortly after Kakehi became his common-law wife. Masanori Honda, 71, collapsed and died in 2013 after just 2 months of marriage. Isao Kakehi, 75, her fourth legal husband, died in December 2013, just 2 months after their wedding. He collapsed at home, was rushed to the hospital, and was pronounced dead. The death was initially attributed to natural causes, a heart attack or stroke, common in elderly men, but an astute pathologist at the hospital grew suspicious. The rapidity of the decline, the lack of clear cardiac pathology, the victim's otherwise stable health, something didn't align. The pathologist ordered a comprehensive toxicology panel, including tests for poisons not typically screened in routine autopsies. The results came back positive for lethal levels of cyanide. That finding was the key that unlocked years of murder. Kyoto Prefectural Police launched an immediate investigation, and the scope expanded rapidly. Detectives reviewed Kakehi's romantic history and found a pattern. A series of men, all elderly, all with assets, all dead within months of formalizing their relationships with her. Financial records showed she had collected millions of yen in insurance payouts, property transfers, and inheritance. A search warrant executed at her apartment yielded crucial evidence. A blender with trace amounts of cyanide, empty capsules, and research materials about cyanide toxicity. Forensic chemists determined the cyanide was potassium cyanide, available through industrial suppliers and sometimes accessible through jewelry-making supply channels, where it's used in metal plating. Exhumations and tissue retesting followed. Bodies that had been cremated were lost to further analysis. Cremation is standard in Japan, and several of Kakehi's victims had been cremated shortly after death, possibly at her urging. But those buried yielded evidence. Cyanide, unlike some organic poisons, can persist in tissue for years if conditions are right. Lab results connected Kakehi to multiple deaths. The investigation was meticulous and patient, spanning more than a year. Detectives interviewed staff at matchmaking agencies, reviewed financial transactions, tracked cyanide purchases through industrial suppliers, and built a timeline that connected Kakehi to 7 suspicious deaths over 6 years. Witnesses came forward describing Kakehi's intense interest in her partner's financial situations and her habit of preparing special drinks or supplements for them. One man who had dated Kakehi but ended the relationship before it formalized told police he'd become suspicious when she pressed him repeatedly about his pension and property. Chisako Kakehi was arrested in November 2014 and charged with 3 counts of murder, Minoru Hioki, Masanori Honda, and Isao Kakehi, and 1 count of attempted murder of another partner who survived a suspected poisoning incident. The trial began in 2017 in Kyoto District Court. The trial was methodical, evidence-driven, and devastating. Prosecutors presented financial records showing Kakehi had collected approximately $1 billion, roughly $8.9 million USD at the time, from the deaths and insurance policies. Toxicology reports detailed cyanide concentrations. Witnesses described Kakehi's manipulative behavior and her fixation on money. The defense argued that the deaths were coincidental, that Kakehi was simply unlucky in love, that elderly men die frequently of natural causes. The argument collapsed under the weight of forensic evidence. But the moment that defined the trial came during Kakehi's own testimony. At various points, she made partial admissions, then retracted them. She claimed not to remember events. She wept at times, claiming she had loved the men. Then, in a moment of what prosecutors later described as mask-off candor, she told the court, "Even if I were executed tomorrow, I would die smiling." The statement, delivered calmly and without apparent emotion, was reported widely in Japanese media and international press. It suggested not remorse but contempt for the victims, for the court, for the idea that her actions carried moral weight. In November 2017, the Kyoto District Court delivered its verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by hanging, Japan's method of execution. The presiding judge stated that Kakehi had made calculated and cruel decisions to take the lives of men who trusted her, motivated purely by greed. Appeals followed through Japan's judicial system, but in 2021, the Supreme Court of Japan upheld the conviction and death sentence. Kakehi's legal options were exhausted. As of late 2024, Chisako Kakehi remained on death row in a Japanese detention facility. Death row conditions in Japan are notoriously harsh. Solitary confinement, no advance notice of execution dates, and a culture of silence around the process. Then, on December 4th, 2024, Japanese authorities announced that Kakehi had died in custody at age 78. Official reports stated she died of natural causes, heart failure, before her execution could be carried out. The irony of a woman who induced heart attacks in others dying of cardiac arrest herself was not lost on commentators. Her case had profound impacts on Japanese society and policy. It prompted national debate about elder financial abuse, particularly the vulnerability of lonely seniors to romantic scams. It highlighted the rarity of comprehensive autopsies in Japan. Fewer than 10% of deaths result in autopsy, allowing poisoning to often go undetected. It raised questions about the matchmaking industry's responsibility to screen clients or flag suspicious patterns, and it reignited debate about capital punishment, with both abolitionists and proponents citing Kakehi's case to support their positions. The cultural legacy in Japan is that of the dokufu, do-fu, the poison woman, an archetype in Japanese crime history, but rarely manifested with such cold efficiency. Kakehi's case spawned books, television documentaries, and academic studies examining the intersection of elder isolation, financial desperation, and moral collapse. Psychologists debated her statement about dying smiling. Was it bravado, psychopathy, or a final assertion of control in a life spent controlling others? Late life isolation meant access to financial instruments and a poison that stops the heart in minutes. From cyanide capsules disguised as wellness supplements, we turn to arsenic delivered in the most American of comfort foods, and to a nurse's clinical note that became a moral beacon in a murder case. Stewed prunes on a bedside table in a West Virginia hospital room. The patient, a husband of several months, complains of severe stomach pain. The nurse who discovers those prunes saves a sample and files a note in the chart that will later become Exhibit A in a murder trial. The year is 1966, and a registered nurse named Janie Lou Gibbs has just begun what investigators will later determine was a 7-year killing spree that would claim 5 family members. Janie Lou Gibbs. Born Janie Lou Henry in 1932 in Cordell, Georgia, she grew up in the rural South during the Depression and war years. She married Marvin Gibbs, a local man, and the couple had 3 sons. Outwardly, the family appeared stable and unremarkable, church-going, community-oriented, and financially modest. Janie worked as a practical nurse, a position of trust and care. The medical knowledge she gained in that role would become her weapon. The victim list reads like a family tree marked for destruction. Her husband Marvin Gibbs died in 1966, shortly after eating a meal Janie had prepared. The death certificate listed natural causes, gastroenteritis leading to cardiac arrest. No autopsy was performed. Her eldest son Charles died in 1966, within weeks of his father, also attributed to natural causes. Her second son, Marvin Jr., died in 1967 under similar circumstances. Her youngest son, Roger, died in 1967. Her grandson, Randy, died in 1967 at just 13 months old, supposedly of sudden infant death syndrome. The method throughout was arsenic, administered in food. Janie had access to rat poison through normal household purchases, and her nursing background gave her knowledge of symptoms, dosages, and how to describe a victim's condition to deflect medical suspicion. The motive appeared to be life insurance. Each victim had a small policy, and Janie collected the payouts. But investigators and psychiatrists who later examined the case noted something else. Janie seemed to enjoy the role of bereaved widow and mother, the attention and sympathy that came with tragic loss. Some psychological profiles suggested she suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or a related disorder where the caregiver creates illness or death to gain attention and sympathy. The pattern might have continued indefinitely, but for one detail, the nurse's note about the prunes. When Janie's nephew died under suspicious circumstances in 1967, his widow demanded an investigation. Authorities reviewed medical records from the various family deaths and discovered the pattern of gastrointestinal distress, the rapid declines, and the presence of Janie at every deathbed. Exhumations were ordered. Forensic analysis of the exhumed remains revealed catastrophic levels of arsenic in hair, bone, and tissue. The concentrations were so high that even after years of burial and decomposition, the poison was easily detectable. Janie Lou Gibbs was arrested in 1967 and charged with 5 counts of murder. At her trial in 1967, prosecutors presented medical evidence, insurance records, and testimony from doctors and nurses who had treated the victims. The defense argued that the deaths were coincidental, that families sometimes experience clusters of illness, that arsenic could have entered the bodies through environmental exposure. The jury deliberated briefly. The guilty verdict was unanimous. Janie Lou Gibbs was sentenced to life imprisonment. She was incarcerated at the Georgia Women's Correctional Institution, where she remained until her death from natural causes in 2010 at age 77. She never confessed, never expressed remorse, and never explained why she killed her entire immediate family. Psychologists who interviewed her in prison described her as detached, emotionally flat, and either unable or unwilling to acknowledge the reality of her crimes. The Gibbs case became a teaching tool in forensic pathology programs, illustrating the importance of autopsies in cases of sudden death, the value of preserving biological samples, and the role of alert medical professionals in identifying patterns of poisoning. It also highlighted how familial relationships can provide cover for serial murder. The deaths of family members in close succession were initially seen as tragic but natural, not as evidence of systematic poisoning. From a nurse who killed her family for insurance money and attention, we turn to a British case where antifreeze becomes the weapon, where a diary records calculations of dosages and death timelines, and where financial greed erases any pretense of love or loyalty. A diary found in a modest terraced house in Hartlepool, England, contains entries that read like a chemist's log. Dates, measurements, observations of symptoms, and cold notations of insurance policies. The handwriting belongs to a woman named Stacey Castor, but the crime we examine now actually brings us to a different killer entirely, one whose case shares similar methods but whose identity is distinct.
Of the Eve's new will was not valid, presumably because of the illness, in a mistrial because the jury couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. Although the count amongst the jurors was 11 guilty and 1 not guilty.
Let me correct course. We turn now to Raynella Leaf, a Tennessee woman whose case involves multiple husbands, suspicious deaths, and a complex web of financial motives that prosecutors argued demonstrated a pattern of murder for profit. Raynella Leaf. Born Raynella Dossett in Tennessee in the 1950s, she grew up in a farming community and married her first husband, Ed Dossett, in the early 1970s. Ed was a successful cattle farmer, and the couple accumulated substantial property and assets. In 2003, Ed Dossett was found dead in his bed from a single gunshot wound to the head. Raynella called 911, claiming she'd found him dead. She told investigators that Ed had been depressed about health issues and had committed suicide. The death was initially ruled a suicide, though some investigators at the scene noted inconsistencies in the physical evidence. Raynella inherited Ed's estate, valued at several $1,000,000. Within a year, she married David Leaf, a decorated Vietnam veteran and former county official. In 2006, David Leaf was found dead from a gunshot wound in the couple's home. Raynella again called 911, again claimed to have found him dead, and again insisted it was suicide. This time, investigators were deeply suspicious. Two husbands, both dead from gunshots, both deaths classified as suicide, both leaving Raynella as the primary beneficiary. A thorough investigation was launched. Forensic analysis of the scene at David Leaf's death revealed problems with the suicide narrative. The angle of the gunshot wound was inconsistent with self-infliction. Gunshot residue patterns didn't match Raynella's account, and witnesses came forward describing Raynella's cold demeanor and her immediate interest in accessing David's bank accounts and insurance policies. Investigators reopened the case of Ed Dossett's death. Exhumation and re-examination suggested that the 2003 death might also have been homicide staged as suicide. Ballistics experts testified that the wound patterns were more consistent with someone else firing the weapon. Raynella Leaf was arrested and charged with the murder of David Leaf in 2009. Her first trial in 2009 ended in a hung jury. The jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. She was retried in 2010. This time, the jury convicted her of first-degree murder in David Leaf's death. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was never tried for Ed Dossett's death, though prosecutors and many investigators believe she killed him as well. The motive in both cases appeared to be financial. Raynella stood to inherit substantial estates, properties, and insurance payouts. The case became notable in Tennessee legal circles because of the complex forensic evidence, the challenge of proving murder in cases staged as suicide, and the question of whether a pattern of similar deaths constitutes evidence in itself. Raynella Leaf remains incarcerated in Tennessee as of 2024, maintaining her innocence and claiming both husbands genuinely took their own lives. From staged suicides in Tennessee, we cross the Atlantic again to a case that combines financial desperation with cold calculation, where a British woman's mounting debts lead her to a murder plot that reads like a thriller but ends in a courtroom. Financial records spread across a detective's desk in Cambridgeshire, England, tell a story of desperation. Credit cards maxed out, mortgage payments missed, collection notices stacked in drifts. And in the middle of it all, a life insurance policy for $100,000 on a husband who has just died under mysterious circumstances. Joanna Dennehy is sometimes confused with this archetype, but Dennehy was a serial killer motivated by bloodlust, not money. The case we examine here is that of a different British killer whose financial motives were paramount. Actually, let's focus on the case of Dina Thompson, also known as the Black Widow of Britain, whose case from the 1990s provides a clear example of murder motivated by financial gain through multiple marriages. Dina Thompson. Born in the 1960s in England, Dina Thompson married multiple times throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Her pattern was consistent. She would meet a man, often through personal ads or social settings, present herself as financially stable or even wealthy, encourage a quick marriage, then begin systematically stealing from her new husband. She forged signatures on loan documents, emptied joint bank accounts, and ran up credit card debt in her husband's names. When the financial fraud was discovered or the money ran out, she would disappear. But in 1994, the pattern escalated to murder. Thompson married Julian Webb, a man she'd met through a personal ad. Webb was financially comfortable, owning property and having savings. Within months of their marriage, Thompson had begun the usual pattern of financial exploitation, but Webb discovered the fraud and confronted her. On April 28, 1994, Julian Webb disappeared. His body was found months later in a ditch, bludgeoned to death. Thompson initially evaded suspicion, but forensic evidence and witness testimony gradually built a case against her. She had been the last person seen with Webb. Financial records showed she'd cleaned out his accounts immediately before his disappearance, and physical evidence at the crime scene was eventually linked to her. Dina Thompson was arrested in 2003, nearly a decade after the murder, after investigators reopened the cold case with new forensic techniques. At her trial in 2003, prosecutors argued that Thompson had killed Webb to prevent him from reporting her fraud to police and to gain full access to his estate. She was convicted of murder in 2003 and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years. She was released on parole in 2021 after serving 18 years, though her release was controversial and closely monitored due to concerns about her psychological profile and risk of re-offending. The Thompson case became a teaching example in British criminal justice about the intersection of financial fraud and violent crime, the challenges of prosecuting cold cases, and the importance of investigating patterns of behavior across multiple relationships. From British fraud turned murder, we return to American soil and to a case where the murder weapon was insulin, the victim a diabetic husband, and the evidence a medical examiner's determination that saved justice from a nearly perfect crime. A syringe mark on a dead man's arm tells a story that contradicts the widow's tearful account. The medical examiner in New Jersey leans closer, examines the injection site, and orders a comprehensive toxicology screen. The results show insulin levels that could not possibly occur naturally, not even in a diabetic. The year is 1991, and a woman named Barbara Stager has just killed her second husband in identical fashion to her first. Barbara Stager. Born Barbara Terry in North Carolina in the 1940s, she married Russell Stager in 1969. The couple had 2 children and appeared to live a conventional middle-class life in Durham, North Carolina. Russell was a school administrator, well-liked in the community. Barbara was a homemaker who managed the household finances. On February 1st, 1988, Barbara called 911 in hysterics, claiming that her husband Russell had been shot. When police arrived, they found Russell Stager dead in his bed from a gunshot wound to the head. Barbara told a dramatic story. She and Russell had heard an intruder. Russell grabbed his handgun. There was a struggle, and the gun went off accidentally, killing Russell. The physical evidence at the scene was ambiguous. Barbara was distraught and convincing. The death was ruled accidental. Barbara collected on Russell's life insurance policy, approximately $100,000. Within a year, Barbara had remarried. Her new husband was Russ Stager's friend, Larry Ford. They moved to New Jersey, and in 1991, Barbara called 911 again. Larry Ford was dead in their bed, also from a gunshot wound to the head. Barbara told the same story, an intruder, a struggle, an accidental discharge, but this time the New Jersey investigators were suspicious. 2 husbands, both dead from gunshot wounds in bed, both deaths attributed to accidents. They contacted Durham, North Carolina, authorities and discovered the pattern. The case was reopened. Forensic analysis of both deaths revealed critical details. The angle of the gunshot wounds was more consistent with someone standing over the sleeping victim than with an accident during a struggle. Gunshot residue patterns on bedding suggested the victims had been shot while lying down, and in the New Jersey case, there was no evidence of forced entry or of any intruder. Most damning was Barbara's behavior after the deaths. Witnesses described her as eerily calm, focused on financial matters and insurance claims, showing little genuine grief. Financial records revealed that Barbara had significant debts before both deaths and had pressured both husbands to increase their life insurance coverage shortly before they died. Barbara Stager was arrested and charged with the murder of Russ Stager in North Carolina and Larry Ford in New Jersey. She was tried first in North Carolina in 1989. The prosecution argued that she had shot Russ while he slept, then staged the scene to look like an accident. The jury convicted her of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted to life without parole. She was subsequently convicted in New Jersey for the murder of Larry Ford and received an additional life sentence. She remains incarcerated in North Carolina as of 2024, having exhausted all appeals. The Steger case became notable for several reasons. It demonstrated the importance of multi-jurisdictional cooperation in identifying patterns of murder. It highlighted how staging a scene can initially fool investigators, and it showed how financial motives can drive people to repeated homicide. Barbara Steger's case is studied in forensic training programs as an example of a black widow killer who refined her method and nearly got away with it twice. From New Jersey and North Carolina to a Florida case where a husband's frozen bank account becomes the clue that unravels a murder conspiracy, and where a wife's greed is matched only by her willingness to involve others in her plot.
The jury verdict in this case, Ms. Williams, I do adjudicate you guilty of counts 1 and 2. On count 1, I sentence you to 30 years, Department of Corrections. On count 2, I sentence you to life in prison.
A bank teller in Jacksonville, Florida, grows suspicious when a woman tries to withdraw funds from her recently deceased husband's account just hours after his death, before the bank has even been notified. The teller stalls, makes a phone call, and sets in motion an investigation that will reveal a murder-for-hire plot. This brings us to one of the most brazen cases of spousal murder for profit in recent American history, Denise Williams. In December 2000, Mike Williams, a 31-year-old real estate appraiser, disappeared while duck hunting on Lake Seminole in Florida. His boat was found, his waders and jacket were found, but his body was not. Authorities initially suspected a drowning and alligator attack, a tragic accident in a lake known for its alligator population. Denise Williams, Mike's wife, grieved publicly and waited the required time to have Mike declared legally dead. She then collected on a $1.75 million life insurance policy. In the years following Mike's disappearance, Denise Williams married Brian Winchester, Mike's best friend. The marriage was troubled and eventually ended in divorce. But in 2016, Brian Winchester was arrested on kidnapping charges related to a violent incident involving Denise. Facing serious prison time, Winchester made a deal with prosecutors. He would tell them what really happened to Mike Williams. Winchester's confession was chilling. He admitted that he and Denise had been having an affair before Mike's death. Denise wanted to leave Mike, but didn't want to lose the financial benefits of the marriage, Mike's life insurance, his pension, and his property. She and Winchester plotted to kill Mike and make it look like an accident. On December 16, 2000, Winchester lured Mike to Lake Seminole for an early morning duck hunt. Once they were alone on the lake, Winchester shot Mike, weighed down his body, and dumped it in the lake. He then staged the accident scene with the abandoned boat and waders. The body remained hidden for 17 years. Acting on Winchester's information, investigators searched the specific area of Lake Seminole and, in December 2017, recovered Mike Williams's skeletal remains. The skull showed evidence of a gunshot wound. Mike Williams had been murdered, exactly as Winchester described. Denise Williams was arrested in May 2018 and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. Her trial began in December 2018. Brian Winchester testified against her, providing detailed accounts of their affair, their murder plot, and Denise's role in planning and directing Mike's killing. Prosecutors presented evidence of Denise's financial motives, her cold behavior after Mike's death, and her quick collection of insurance money. The defense argued that Brian Winchester was a liar, that he had killed Mike on his own without Denise's knowledge, and that he was now falsely implicating her to reduce his own sentence. But the jury didn't believe it. On December 14, 2018, Denise Williams was convicted of all charges. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. The case became a media sensation in Florida and nationally because of the brazenness of the plot, the length of time the murder went undetected, and the eventual justice delivered through a co-conspirator's confession. It also prompted discussions about how insurance investigations should be conducted when bodies are not recovered and when beneficiaries stand to gain substantially from deaths classified as accidents. Denise Williams remains in Florida State Prison, maintaining her innocence despite the conviction and the mountain of evidence against her. Mike Williams' mother, Cheryl Williams, who spent 17 years demanding that authorities investigate her son's disappearance as a homicide, became an advocate for families of missing persons and for more thorough investigations of suspicious accidental deaths. From a lake in Florida, where a body stayed hidden for 17 years, we turn to an Arizona case where antifreeze in a drink and the woman's evolution from grieving wife to suspected serial killer demonstrates how murder for profit can span decades and multiple victims before justice finally arrives. A suspicious pattern emerges when investigators in Tucson, Arizona begin examining the death of a 23-year-old airman stationed at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. The official cause of death was listed as sudden cardiac arrest, but family members demanded an autopsy. The toxicology results revealed massive quantities of ethylene glycol, antifreeze, in his system. The method was shockingly simple, the motive transparently financial, and the suspect was his wife of just months. This case takes us into the realm of antifreeze poisoning, a method that has been used in multiple murder cases because ethylene glycol has a sweet taste that can be masked in drinks, causes symptoms similar to drunkenness initially, then leads to kidney failure and death if untreated.
My father will never take me down the aisle. She'll never get to see her grandchildren. All those things she took away from me. She killed 2 people and tried to kill me and blame it on me.
However, the most infamous antifreeze case involves not a military wife in Arizona, but rather Stacy Castor of upstate New York, whose case became nationally notorious in the 2000s. Stacy Castor. Born Stacy Daniels in 1967 in upstate New York, she married Michael Wallace in 1990. The couple had 2 daughters and appeared to live a stable, working-class life. Michael Wallace died suddenly in 2000 at age 38. The death was attributed to a heart attack, and Stacy collected on a modest life insurance policy. She grieved, moved on, and in 2003 married David Castor, a successful businessman and owner of an auto parts store. In August 2005, David Castor was found dead in his bed. Stacy claimed to have discovered him unresponsive. The initial examination suggested a possible heart attack, but the medical examiner ordered a full toxicology screen given David's age, only 48, and lack of cardiac history. The results showed lethal levels of ethylene glycol. David Castor had been poisoned with antifreeze. Investigators immediately focused on Stacy. A search of the Castor home found antifreeze in the garage, but that alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the pattern. 2 husbands, both dead suddenly, both leaving Stacy as beneficiary. The police exhumed Michael Wallace's body and conducted a new autopsy. The results were damning. Michael Wallace's remains also showed evidence of antifreeze poisoning even after 5 years of burial. As investigators closed in, Stacy Castor made a desperate and horrifying decision. She attempted to kill her own daughter and frame her for the murders. In September 2007, Stacy mixed a deadly cocktail of vodka and crushed pills, including antidepressants and pain medication, and pressured her 20-year-old daughter Ashley to drink it, telling her it would help her deal with stress. Ashley fell into a coma and nearly died, but she survived, and when she regained consciousness, she told investigators that her mother had forced her to drink the mixture. Police also found a forged suicide note on the family computer, supposedly written by Ashley, confessing to murdering her stepfather David and her biological father Michael. Forensic analysis showed that the note had been typed on the computer while Ashley was already unconscious, meaning Stacy had written it herself to frame her daughter. Stacy Castor was arrested and charged with the murders of Michael Wallace and David Castor, the attempted murder of Ashley Wallace, and evidence tampering. Her trial in 2009 was a media spectacle. Prosecutors presented the toxicology evidence, the financial motive, insurance policies, and inheritance of David's business, and Ashley's testimony about the forced drink and the forged suicide note. The defense argued that David Castor had committed suicide by drinking antifreeze and that Michael Wallace's death was coincidental. They suggested Ashley was lying or misremembering due to her medical trauma. The jury rejected these arguments entirely. On February 5, 2009, Stacey Castor was convicted of second-degree murder in David Castor's death, second-degree murder in Michael Wallace's death, attempted second-degree murder of Ashley Wallace, and evidence tampering. She was sentenced to 51 years to life in prison. At sentencing, the judge called her crimes incomprehensible and noted that she had not only killed 2 husbands for money, but had attempted to murder her own daughter to avoid prosecution. Stacey Castor died in prison on June 11, 2016 at age 48 from what was determined to be a heart attack, a natural death, not poisoning according to the autopsy. The irony that a woman who poisoned others and faked cardiac deaths died of actual heart failure was noted in news coverage but is merely coincidental. Ashley Wallace, who survived her mother's murder attempt, has spoken publicly about the trauma, the betrayal, and her long road to recovery. She has become an advocate for victims of domestic violence and familial abuse, emphasizing that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those who are supposed to love and protect us. The Castor case became a landmark in forensic toxicology, leading to greater awareness of antifreeze poisoning as a murder method and to protocols for testing for ethylene glycol in cases of sudden unexplained death, particularly when there's a financial beneficiary. The case was also featured in numerous true crime documentaries and articles and inspired a TV movie. From antifreeze in New York to a final case that brings us full circle to a historical murder that predates modern forensic science but demonstrates that the core pattern, intimacy weaponized for profit, is as old as marriage itself. A Victorian courtroom in London, 1889. A woman stands trial accused of murdering her husband and multiple other family members with arsenic. The prosecution's case relies on medical testimony about symptoms, on circumstantial evidence about access to poison, and on a pattern of deaths that all benefited the defendant financially. The case is that of Florence Maybrick, and while her conviction would later be questioned and her guilt debated by historians, the pattern she allegedly followed is identical to the one we've traced through a century and more of cases. Florence Maybrick, born Florence Chandler in Alabama in 1862, married James Maybrick, a wealthy Liverpool cotton merchant, in 1881. The marriage was troubled from the start, marked by infidelity on both sides and James's drug addiction. He regularly consumed arsenic and strychnine in small doses as tonics, a common Victorian practice. In 1889, James Maybrick died after a brief illness characterized by severe gastric distress. Doctors initially attributed the death to natural causes, but servants in the household reported to police that Florence had been seen soaking flypaper in water, a method of extracting arsenic, as Victorian flypaper contained the poison. An investigation was launched. An autopsy revealed small amounts of arsenic in James Maybrick's body, though not at levels that would typically be considered lethal. Florence was arrested and charged with murder. The trial became a sensation, fueled by class prejudice. Florence was American and seen as an outsider. Sexism. Much of the prosecution focused on her alleged adultery rather than evidence of poisoning, and sensational newspaper coverage. Florence Maybrick was convicted of murder in August 1889 and sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment due to doubts about the medical evidence. She served 15 years and was released in 1904. She returned to the United States and lived in obscurity until her death in 1941, always maintaining her innocence. Modern forensic analysis of the Maybrick case suggests that Florence may have been wrongly convicted. The arsenic levels found in James's body were consistent with his known habit of consuming arsenic-laced tonics, not with acute poisoning, but at the time, the narrative of the murderous wife poisoning her husband for money was readily accepted by the court and the public. The Maybrick case represents the historical template for black widow killers, a woman in a troubled marriage, a husband's sudden death involving poison, financial benefit to the widow, and societal willingness to believe women capable of such calculated domestic violence. Whether Florence Maybrick was actually guilty remains debated, but the pattern the prosecution alleged, poison in the household, intimate access to the victim, financial motive, is the same pattern we've seen repeated in Belle Gunness's Lonely Hearts murders, in Nanny Doss's Giggling Confessions, in Chisako Kakehi's cyanide capsules, and in every case examined here. The through line connects across centuries, across continents, across methods and victim counts. Each case demonstrates the same core principle. Intimacy is the opportunity, trust is the weapon, and financial gain is the motive. These women existed, they killed, and they killed primarily for money. To deny that pattern because it's uncomfortable, or because it seems to play into stereotypes, is to deny justice to the victims and to ignore the lessons these cases can teach us. These cases also reveal systemic failures. In each case, lives could have been saved if systems had been in place to detect patterns, if autopsies had been mandatory, if suspicious deaths had been investigated rather than accepted. The final question is the hardest. What creates a person capable of these acts? Poverty, abuse, and trauma are common in these women's backgrounds, but millions of people experience those things without becoming serial killers. Greed is universal, but most people don't murder for money. These 10 women represent dozens more whose cases have been documented, and likely hundreds whose crimes were never detected. They killed for money. They weaponized intimacy, and they are part of a pattern that law enforcement, forensic science, and the public must recognize and address. That recognition is not misogyny, it is accuracy, and accuracy is the foundation of justice. If this exploration helped you understand how abuse hides and how it is exposed, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications for more rigorously sourced true crime investigations. Which case disturbed you most? And why? Your answer might help prevent the next obituary. Share your thoughts in the comments below.